Hi, so this week on the podcast, the very first episode of season 3, I have Garrett Smith from TodayInHistoryBuff. And I have to say, your page is my favorite history page on Instagram. Hands down, I think you do a fantastic job of explaining historical events in a way that it's easily consumable for people like me that aren't history experts. So thank you for having that page, first of all. And Garrett, you have amassed over 14,000 followers in the last couple of years running this page. So that is incredible and super impressive. And I obviously am not the only one that feels that way about your page. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
So I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about your page and what kind of inspired you to start Today in History Buff.
Sure, yeah. Well, first of all, thank you so much for your compliments. You following, of course, and everyone following means the world to me. A page is nothing without its followers. So I have to, you guys, you and everyone who follows, you guys play as much of a role in it as I do. I may be the one that leads the page, but it would be nothing without you guys. So thank you. And
Mhm.
I give a lot of credit to God for that as well. I pray a lot for the page, and I pray, you know, um, that it will be successful and that it will be, just honoring to Him.
Mhm.
So, again, thank you to everyone for following. So, I actually started this page back it was the spring, it was May of 2017. And I actually remember my first ever post was on Margaret Thatcher becoming the first female prime minister of the United Kingdom, which occurred in 1979. And I just remember, that's a cool event, Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady. Um, so I thought, when I started the page, um, for the longest time, I started doing like one event per day. I thought, that's the best way to keep track. And I'm kind of OCD, so I thought,
Mhm.
okay, that's the best way to keep track of how long I've ran this page.
Mhm.
If I do one, one post per day. Um, but then earlier this year, I think it was in April, I kind of got the idea that, I'm using this page a lot more than my personal page. So I just decided to go ahead and make this my personal page. So, and I'm glad I did
Yeah.
because, you know, I'm able to connect so much more personable with people. And, I don't think there's anything wrong with showing, you know, if you've got a big following, showing a little bit of your personal life, be transparent with people.
Yeah.
That's how you build good relationships. And we're blessed to live in the time period that we live in where
Mhm.
we can do things like you and I are doing right now across time zones. I mean, a
Yeah.
100 years ago, who would have even imagined that you could do something like this?
Yeah.
So we're very fortunate, very blessed that we can be able to do like we're doing right now. So, I like you were talking about with the page, I do that's what I strive to do. I try to make it, you know, as simple as I can for people to understand.
Mhm.
History is not everyone's forte. And
Absolutely
that's
not.
totally
Not
fine.
mine.
Well,
Yeah.
that's totally fine. But I try to make it interesting, and I even try to pick events that I think are interesting. And most of the
Mhm.
time, I still pick one event per day. Now, I've been doing quite a lot of collabs lately, but I
Mhm.
still try to pick one event per day. And usually, you know, sometimes it's hard to pick one event because if you've got a certain day where a lot of things have happened,
Yeah.
it's like, oh, which one do I choose? But I pick one that I think a lot of people are going to remember, or maybe one that is very interesting and a lot of people, don't know a lot about it.
Mhm.
Sometimes those are good events, sometimes those are bad events, but
Yeah.
nonetheless, it's history, and history is not there, for you to necessarily like. It's there for you to remember it, and in some cases appreciate it, and then in some cases condemn it where it's necessary. But
Yeah.
overall, that's just the gist of my page.
Yeah. That's awesome. You're doing a really good job with it.
Thank you.
So, I want to jump right into today's topic, which is Columbus Day. It is coming up, and a lot of people feel some kind of way about it these days. So, previously it was called just Columbus Day. Now it's Columbus Day slash Indigenous Peoples Day, or some people just refer to it as Indigenous Peoples Day, and that would fall on October 9th, Monday, October 9th this year of 2023. So, I wanted to ask you a first question about Columbus. Do you agree with this statement? Columbus discovered America.
Yes. Now, that
Okay.
being said, that is a very loaded statement. So,
Hmm.
and me saying yes is a very, very simplified answer. So, let me
Hmm.
explain. If someone drops their credit card on the ground outside the grocery store and I
Hmm.
find it, I've discovered your credit card on the ground outside the grocery store.
Yeah.
Now, that being said, that doesn't mean I'm the first one to find it. It does mean I discovered it. And it is because of Columbus's discovery that we thank the fact that, you know, I mean, at the end of the day, I know this is a very, 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 very simplified way to put it, but at the end of the day, as hard as it is maybe to imagine, Columbus, discovering America, even though again, and I have to reiterate this, especially in
Hmm.
today's age. I get it. He wasn't
Hmm.
the first one here. I
Hmm.
get that. But that being aside, I think everyone understands, that yeah, Columbus wasn't the first one here. But Columbus discovering America the way that he did, which when we say America, it was actually the Caribbean. To the best of my knowledge, I don't think Columbus himself ever set foot on the continental United States.
Hmm.
Um, it was the Caribbean that Columbus, like the Bahamas, areas like that, that Columbus frequented with his expeditions. But it's
Okay.
because of Columbus finding the Americas in the manner that he did, the reason that we get to sit here and do this today.
Right.
Um, Everything leads to somewhere, and that's just how I look at it. So yeah,
Yeah.
Columbus did discover America. He may not have been by far the first one here,
Right.
but he still found it. It doesn't take away from the fact that Christopher Columbus discovered America. He did.
Hmm.
So that's my answer to that.
Okay, that's fair. And do you think that he's given enough credit, not enough credit, or just enough credit for his work in discovering America, that is?
Right. And the thing is, I think it depends on which circle you talk to, because there are here in 2023, there are so many loaded opinions about Columbus, and everyone has that circle of people that they agree with when it comes to Columbus. Um, I've seen some circles that go way above, and they're like, oh yeah, Columbus. And I've
Hmm.
seen some people who are just neutral. They're like, oh okay, yeah, that's a thing that he did. And I've seen some people who bring up, oh, Columbus, he was a colonizer, he was a slaver, which, and I'm sure that we'll probably get more into it. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but
Hmm.
yes, Columbus did have slaves, and he did have, Native Americans enslaved, and he did have, or he was exploring and discovered America during the age of conquest, the age of exploration. When conquest
Hmm.
was a universal thing, it wasn't just Columbus.
Yeah.
And that's a point that I would like to bring up. And again, you can correct me if I'm wrong, if we're gonna, because I'm not trying to get off topic.
Right.
um, or you can stop me if you think we're gonna get further into this in a
No,
little
no,
bit.
keep going. Yep, you're good.
But conquest was a universal thing. Like I said, when Columbus found America, conquest was something that was happening all across the world. I mean, and honestly, and this is absolutely, I want to make this clear. I feel like I shouldn't have to, but I want to make this clear that this is not a condoning of
Hmm.
conquest
Right.
or colonization or slavery or anything like that. It's sad that you have to make that abundantly clear in today's
Right.
age, but just so we're clear, I'm not condoning any of those things, but
Right.
slavery and conquest prior to the American founding were universal worldwide things, and slavery actually still continues today in parts of the world, and
Yeah.
people are completely silent about it, but yet they hate America for, you know, participating in it over 160 years ago. So, when Columbus found America, yes, there was slavery, yes, there was colonization and conquest, but again, it was universal. And I
Right.
think when a lot of people hate on Columbus and they really try to discredit him, they associate this colonization or slavery with it was a European thing, it was a white man's thing,
Hmm.
and that's just simply not true. That
Yeah.
is absolutely not true. So that's
Yeah.
that's my stance on Columbus. I think it depends on whether or not he's remembered appropriately or
Hmm.
accurately. Some people, like you pretty much said, some people love him and go above and beyond. Some people are just neutral, and some people are just, screw him. It depends on the circle,
Yeah.
So, but that is my stance, and that
Yeah.
is when he was, doing his thing, yeah, he did a lot of, I mean, sketchy things, but
Yeah.
they were things that were endemic to the world at the time.
Yeah, and I will definitely agree with your statement there that it was normal for that time. Obviously, looking back now, as we are a more civilized society, we acknowledge his faults and we acknowledge his wrongdoings. But I think that
Absolutely.
in the same breath, we can also acknowledge that he did some pretty wonderful things that brought us to where we are today. I think that people tend to look at simply the bad things that people have done, which were normal for that time period. And they kind of hold on to that and say, this person overall is just a horrible person because of this one bad thing that they did. I was born in the West African country of Cameroon, which was colonized by the German, the French, and the English. So we're split Anglophone and Francophone because of that. And that's something that I've had to kind of think about, as in I speak French because we were colonized by the French. So it's something that I've been frustrated with for a very long time. But also, I've acknowledged that that was what people did during that time. They tried to gain as many colonies and as much land as possible. This was not just uh, we were not any more special than any other part of the world for what happened to us. It happened throughout the world. Though now we have obviously our independence, it was just something that was normal for that time period. And I think that a lot of people need to accept that in a lot of these historical figures as well, that they did things that were normal for the time, which are absolutely crazy to us now. So, yeah, I definitely agree with your sentiment on that.
I think that's very cool that you were born, you said, in Cameroon.
Yeah.
That's cool. I didn't know that. That's very
Mhm.
cool. That's very cool.
Thank you. Um, yeah, but getting back into Columbus and his work, I think that you kind of talked about how you feel about his work and everything like that. But now I want to talk about his impact in today's world. So we see a lot of politicians and political activists calling for his monuments to be taken down. How do you feel about that? Do you think it's appropriate?
You know, taking down monuments is another one of those really touchy subjects. It's such a loaded thing to think about. And I'll be just being completely honest with you. I have thought long and hard about the statue incident, or the statue conundrum, I guess you could call it. And,
Yeah.
I would have to say, at the end of the day, I can completely understand and honestly even support some people saying, why don't we relocate some of the statues? Like, why don't
Mm,
we, maybe take them out of the, you know, maybe out of the town square and just put it in a museum.
Yeah.
Some people argue that maybe it would even be more acknowledged if you
Mm.
put it in a museum. Um, I do not support tearing down statues, and I can tell you why. The reason
Okay.
being, when you start that trend, you don't stop. And when the riots happened in 2020, nationwide, you know, it started, people were tearing down colonial statues or statues of colonial figures, because they're supposedly evil and racist, but yet these same people also tore down statues of Frederick Douglass and John Brown and Abraham Lincoln. So you get where I'm going. Like, it's
Yeah.
not, once you set that precedent, you don't stop, and it just grows from there. So that's why I'm against taking down the statues, because it just sets a very bad example, and it just opens the door to doing ridiculous stuff. So that's my position on the statues, and they do serve as a reminder.
Right.
Again, it kind of goes back to, history is not always there for you to like. It's there to be
Exactly.
there and teach you. That's what it's
Hmm.
there for.
Hmm.
And it's there for you to like when it's appropriate. It's there for you to appreciate when it's appropriate. It's there for you to hate it when it's appropriate.
Yeah.
Um, but it's there to be acknowledged. That's why it's there. So that's my stance on, I guess, what you could call the statue conundrum.
No, I think that's very reasonable in the sense that, as you beautifully said, that history is not there for us to like it. It's just there. It's something that we need to be reminded of constantly. So at times we perhaps don't repeat it, and at times we do attempt to repeat it. So I think that is my issue with the monument conundrum as well, because once you start looking at issues with each and every political figure or
Mhm.
historical figure, you will find something. If you dig far enough, you'll find that maybe they cut off people when they drove down the street and you got to take their statue down now. And you'll find something. Obviously, we're
Right.
talking about bigger things when we're talking about slave owners, of course. We can acknowledge that and acknowledge that that's a horrible thing. And I think that most Americans would say that was a horrible thing. But I think, again, we should be able to disconnect between the horrible things that this person did and the things that we could also learn historically from that person. So yeah, I definitely agree with your thoughts there as well. Um, yeah. So um, about Indigenous Peoples Day, what do you refer to Columbus Day as? Do you prefer Columbus Day or Indigenous Peoples Day? And do you think that, what are your thoughts on either or?
Sure. So, I'm definitely sympathetic to, you know, the people that the bad things happen to. Absolutely. And there is a very, for lack of better ways to put it, there is a very unfortunate history of mistreatment of Native
Hmm.
Americans in this country. They weren't even, you know, they weren't even granted citizenship in the United States until I think it was 1924. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but it was under President Calvin Coolidge. Um, that Native Americans were even granted citizenship in the United States. So there's that. And, when it comes to the Columbus Day versus Indigenous Peoples Day, I mean, I personally, I call it Columbus Day because that's just what I've always been raised on. I mean, they even talked about Columbus Day. They taught us a little Columbus song, about how in 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue.
Yeah.
When I was in kindergarten, now of course it sounded a lot better than that. You don't want me to sing it, but you know, that's just that's how I remember it. Um, and if you think about it, and I'm not trying to offend anyone at all when I say this, but if we didn't have Columbus Day, Indigenous Peoples Day wouldn't have been thought of to begin with. That's why we have Indigenous Peoples Day, is because some people would rather remember Columbus Day as Indigenous Peoples Day. So, you really, I mean, at the end of the day, you kind of have to thank Columbus Day for that too, because if you didn't have that, then you wouldn't have Indigenous Peoples Day.
Yeah.
So, I look at it as, you know, people on that day, they can celebrate whatever they want to, though. If you want to celebrate Native American heritage or Native American history on that day, that's fine. If you want to celebrate Columbus and his voyages and his expeditions and discoveries on that day, that's fine. Um, it's, I think my big thing is, why can't we just respect, why can't each party respect the other? And, maybe both could teach each other something. And that's how
Yeah.
I look at it.
I think that the addition of Indigenous Peoples Day is kind of obviously, as you said, in response to Columbus Day.
Mhm.
So I don't understand why there needs. I think there's an assumption, right, that Columbus Day celebrating Columbus Day means that we hate Indigenous people. That's
Right.
kind of the connection there that at least I'm making.
Hmm.
So in order to compensate, they're like, okay, we need to add this to the day so that it's not insinuated that celebrating Columbus Day makes you a racist. So I really hate that there is that connection there where you
Hmm.
can't acknowledge Columbus Day and call it Columbus Day, or that makes you essentially a bigot for not acknowledging all the indigenous people that he killed or enslaved and all these different things.
Hmm.
It's like,
Well,
yes,
and
we
if you
see
don't
that.
mind, there is something that I actually would like to add on top of that. We were talking
Yeah.
about the conquest, and I promise I'm not trying to interrupt you. I
Oh,
have
no,
to
no, go
throw this
ahead.
in there,
Mm.
or I might forget it. So when you're talking about conquest and things like that, it's like we were saying earlier. You know, it was a universal concept. Um, you know, so what a lot of people don't understand, and I get it, European colonization, of course, was on a much bigger scale than, you know, um, Native American tribal warfare, African tribal warfare, anything like that. I get that.
Right.
So I completely understand that. That out of the equation, Native Americans themselves were very complicit in conquest against other tribes, taking territory from other tribes, enslaving people from other tribes. Um, they even, the Native Americans themselves, prior to the Civil War, when the first African slaves were brought over, Native Americans themselves had black slaves. In fact, on the Trail of Tears, it wasn't just Native Americans that were on the Trail of Tears, it was Native Americans and some of their black slaves were on the Trail
Wow.
of Tears. Um, During the Civil War, there were some. There were some Native Americans who sided with the Confederacy. They were interested in slavery. They owned slaves. So, you know, that goes back to the whole. I had to get that out there. That Native
Yeah.
Americans themselves, just like the entire world, were complicit in warfare against other tribes, slavery. And I
Yeah.
hear people, what gets me is I hear people make excuses like, oh, well, that was just like a bone cast system, or that wasn't real slavery. Okay, yeah. So you, yeah, okay, real slavery, sure.
And I also think that there's this assumption that Native Americans were these peaceful, kumbaya individuals, like groups that didn't want to hurt anybody or never hurt a fly, but they were very violent because that was
Yes,
how things were back then. And
yes.
people want to, they were the victims of European colonization. I will acknowledge that. However, that doesn't mean that they were saints.
Right.
So to have, to go back to the original question of adding Indigenous Peoples Day to Columbus Day, there's an assumption that, that these Indigenous people that were affected by the actions of Columbus
Hmm.
were peaceful, calm, like very gentle people. And that that is not a fair assessment of the situation. So there's also that.
True. Yes.
Yeah. Well, that is all in terms of questions that I had today in terms of Columbus and Columbus Day. Is there anything else that you wanted to add in closing?
I just want to say I did not know this was the first episode of season 3, so now I feel even more honored to be here. So that's awesome. That is excellent. Thank you so much for having me, and I hope your
Yeah.
audience enjoyed. I am always here. If anyone wants to talk, feel free to message me. You can even give me a call on Instagram or whatever you want to do. Just, it's always a pleasure. I feel blessed to have you in as a Insta friend, and that we can, live in this day and age where we can do things like this. So, to anyone watching or listening who is interested in following either of us, please feel free to.
Mhm.
And thank you again so much. It was a real pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on.